The ballroom of Hollowmere Manor had never glittered so brightly. Sable Renwick stood at the edge of the marble balcony, one hand curled around the cold iron railing, the other pressed flat against the silk of her gown where it stretched over her stomach. Below her, 300 guests moved like jeweled fish through the great hall, their laughter rising in waves to where she watched from the shadows. Crystal chandeliers spun light across the painted ceiling. A string quartet played something delicate and old. The scent of white lilies and beeswax candles drifted up to her hiding place, and she had to swallow hard against the nausea that had not left her for 6 weeks. She should not have come. She had told herself 100 times that she would not come. She had told herself she would stay in the small suite the housekeeping staff had given her, that she would lie on the narrow bed and press a cool cloth to her forehead and wait for him to come find her, the way he always did. The way he had promised. But Caleb had not come for 3 nights. 3 nights of silence. 3 nights without a note slipped beneath her door. Without the soft knock against her window after the household slept. Without the heat of his body wrapped around hers in the dark. And the longer the silence stretched, the louder the whispers grew in the servants' wing. The engagement gala. The bride. The announcement that would seal the alliance between 2 of the oldest wolf families in the northern provinces. Sable had pressed her ear to the wall and listened, her heart breaking with every word. Now she stood above the celebration she had not been invited to attend, watching the man she loved laugh with a woman who was not her. He had not seen her yet. None of them had. The eastern gallery was meant for portraits and shadows, not for guests, and the sconces along its walls had been left unlit for atmosphere. Sable was nothing more than a darker shape against the dark, her midnight blue gown indistinguishable from the velvet drapes that framed the colonnade. She had chosen the color on purpose. She had chosen all of this on purpose. She had wanted to see him before she let herself believe. She had wanted to know. Caleb Verith stood at the center of the ballroom in a coat the color of storm clouds, his dark hair swept back from his forehead, his amber eyes catching every light in the room. Even from this distance, even through the glass of the partition, Sable could feel the pull of him. The mark on the inside of her left wrist throbbed in time with his pulse. The bond she had been told was sacred, was forever, was the rarest thing a wolf could find in this world, hummed beneath her skin like a struck bell. He had given her the mark on the night of the autumn moon, 6 months ago, in the orchard behind his family's hunting lodge. He had pressed his teeth to the soft inside of her wrist, where the veins ran blue and close to the surface, and he had whispered a vow against her skin that had made her weep. "You are mine, Sable Renwick, not because the council allows it, not because the bloodlines approve. You are mine because the moon decided it the day you were born, and there is nothing in this kingdom or any other that will keep me from you." She had believed him. She had believed him when he climbed through her window on stormy nights with rain in his hair. She had believed him when he traced the curve of her jaw with hands that shook. She had believed him 3 weeks ago, when she had finally found the courage to tell him about the dizziness, the strange tenderness, the missed cycles, and he had pressed his forehead to her belly and laughed through his tears, and said the words she had been so afraid to hear. A child. Sable, we are going to have a child. She had not told anyone else. She had not been able to. Her mother had died when she was 9. Her father had drunk himself into a grave the year after. The cousin who had taken her in had passed her to the Verith household as a kitchen girl when she was 16, glad to be rid of the burden, and Sable had spent 4 years scrubbing copper pots in the basement before Caleb had found her crying in the herb garden one summer evening and asked her name. He was the only family she had left. He was the only family she had ever truly had. And now she stood above his engagement gala with his child stirring beneath her ribs, and she watched as Marisol Aithwin drifted through the crowd toward him in a gown the color of poured cream. Marisol, her best friend. the girl who had shared her narrow bed in the servants' attic for 2 winters, who had braided Sable's hair before the harvest dances, who had sworn on her own mother's grave that she would carry Sable's secret to the end of her days. Marisol Aithwen, who had wept on Sable's shoulder 6 months ago when she confessed she had begun to dream of Calum, that she could not stop thinking of him, that she did not know what to do with the wanting. Sable had held her and stroked her hair and told her gently that he belonged to another now, that the dreams would fade, that some loves were not meant to be ours. Marisol had nodded against her shoulder and whispered that she understood. 2 months later, Marisol had been promoted from the kitchens to the upper household. 3 months later, she had stopped sleeping in the attic. 4 months later, she had stopped speaking to Sable altogether. And tonight, in a gown that must have cost more than 3 years of a kitchen girl's wages, Marisol Aithwen walked toward Calum Vairith with her hand outstretched and a smile that did not reach her ice-pale eyes. The string quartet fell silent. Sable's nails drove into the iron of the railing. A hush spread across the ballroom like frost across a window pane, guest by guest, conversation by conversation, until 300 people stood waiting and breathing and watching as Calum Vairith took Marisol's hand in his. The patriarch of House Vairith stepped forward onto the small platform at the head of the room. He was an old wolf, silver-bearded, his voice carrying without effort to every corner of the hall. "Tonight," he said, "we honor an alliance generations in the making. The union of House Vairith and House Aithwen will bind the eastern and western territories of the kingdom in a bond of blood and loyalty that no enemy will ever break." He turned. "My son. The vow." Sable could not breathe. Calum stood very still. He did not look down at Marisol. He did not look at his father. His face, that beautiful familiar face, was strangely empty. His eyes had gone flat in a way she had never seen them go, even in the worst of his dark moods. There was a stillness to his body that did not belong to him. He stood the way a man stands in a dream, the way a body stands when something has stepped out of it and left only the shape behind. For one impossible heartbeat, Sable thought he would refuse. For one impossible heartbeat, she pressed her hand harder against her belly and let herself believe that he would speak her name instead. That he would tell them all, in front of every powerful wolf in the kingdom, that his vow had already been given to a kitchen girl in an orchard 6 months ago, and that no alliance of houses could undo what the moon had already sealed. She believed it for one heartbeat. Then Calum opened his mouth. "I take Marisol Aithwen as my chosen mate," he said, "by my blood, by my wolf, by the honor of my house, and by the witness of every wolf within these walls." The ballroom erupted. The applause hit Sable like a wave breaking against stone. She staggered back from the railing, one hand flying to her wrist, where the mark beneath her sleeve had begun to burn. Not the gentle warmth she had grown used to over the months. This was a searing, splitting pain, as if something were being torn out of her flesh by the roots. She bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out, and the taste of copper flooded her mouth. Below, Marisol turned her face up to Calum and smiled the smile of a woman who had won. And Calum, the man who had sworn she was his on a bed of fallen apple leaves, did not look up at the gallery. He did not search the shadows. He did not even seem to remember that the shadows were a place where someone might hide. A sob broke loose from Sable's throat. She pressed her fist against her mouth to muffle it. The world had narrowed to the burning in her wrist, and the sound of her own ragged breathing and the distant roar of the crowd that did not know she existed. She turned and ran. The eastern gallery led to a servant's staircase that wound down into the wine cellars. From there, a passage cut beneath the manor to the stables. Sable knew every inch of the route. She had run it 100 times in stolen nightgowns to meet a man who had been lying to her, or who had been broken by something she did not yet understand. Her slippered feet made no sound on the stone steps. The skirts of her midnight gown caught and tore on a nail. She did not stop to free them. She tore the fabric loose and kept moving. In her tiny servant's chamber on the third floor, she had already packed. She had packed 3 days ago, the moment the first whisper of engagement had reached her ears, because some part of her had known. Some part of her had always known that a kitchen girl with a mark on her wrist and a child in her belly was not the kind of story the great houses allowed to end well. Her satchel waited beneath the bed. Inside it, 2 plain dresses, a healer's kit she had assembled in secret over the last 2 years, a small pouch of saved coin, and the only thing she owned that had ever belonged to her mother. A pendant of pale river stone strung on a leather cord, carved with a symbol no living person seemed to recognize. Sable pulled her cloak around her shoulders. She paused at the narrow window and looked out across the moonlit grounds, where bonfires had been lit along the carriageway, in celebration of the engagement that had just been announced. Somewhere down there, Caleb was being toasted. Somewhere down there, Marisol was being congratulated. Somewhere down there, the life Sable had thought was hers was being given to someone else with the consent of every wolf who mattered. She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. "Be safe, my little one," she whispered to the child beneath her ribs. "Wherever we go from here, we go together." Then she turned, and she slipped out through the servant's door, and she vanished into the cold dark of the gardens. She did not look back. She did not see the shape that had moved against the high arched window of the western tower. She did not see the broad shoulders silhouetted there, the long dark coat, the pale hand pressed flat against the glass as if it were trying to push through it. She did not see the eyes that had not been looking at the engagement at all, but had been searching the gallery, the colonnade, and the shadows, with a focus so total that the man beside him had spoken to him 3 times without being heard. She did not hear. An hour later, when the sky over Hollowmere split open with a howl no wolf in 3 provinces had voice enough to make. She did not hear what the high-born guests would whisper of for years afterward. The Alpha King of the North, who had ridden 2 days through a winter storm to attend an engagement gala that was not his own, who had stood silent at the western window through the entire ceremony, who had turned at the moment of the vow and walked out of Hollowmere Manor without a word to anyone, and ridden into the night like a man pursuing something that had already been taken from him. By the time the bonfires guttered low and the last of the carriages rolled away from the manor, Sable Renwick was 3 miles into the forest with her satchel on her back and the taste of blood still in her mouth. By the time the Alpha King of the North reached the eastern gallery, all he found was a torn strip of midnight blue silk caught on a nail in the doorway, still warm where her hand had passed. 4 months later, in the village of Brier Hollow, the snows began at last to soften. The thaw came slowly that year. The rivers cracked first, then the eaves of the cottages, then the long white fields that stretched between the village and the dark line of the whispering pines. By the first day of the third moon, the road into the valley had become passable again, and the traveling tinkers who had wintered in the southern lowlands returned with their carts of needles and ribbons and news. The woman who lived in the cottage at the end of Mill Lane did not go to meet the tinkers. The villagers had grown used to that. The healer, they called her, because she had not given them a family name when she arrived in the dead of winter, and because she had not corrected them when they began to call her by the work she did instead. She had come walking up the frozen road on a night so cold the well had iced over, with a satchel over her shoulder and a belly that even her cloak could not entirely hide. The miller's wife had taken her in and given her a bowl of barley soup and a pallet by the fire. By morning, the old herbalist had set aside her own grief at her son's broken leg and let the stranger try her hand at the splint, and the splint had been so precisely set, so cleanly bound, that the herbalist had wept. "Stay," the old woman had said, "stay, and the village will give you a roof." Her name, she told them when she had finally found the courage to give one, was Wren. It was not her name, but it had been her mother's, before her mother had married a drunkard and traded her own name for his. Sable had carried it like a candle through the long walk north, And when the miller's wife had asked her at last what to call her, the word had come out of her mouth before she could think. Wren. A small brown thing that hid in hedges and sang only when no one was looking. It suited her well enough. In the 4 months since her arrival, Wren had become something the village had not known it needed. She set bones. She drew out fevers. She brewed teas for the hard coughs that plagued the children at the end of every winter, and she made poultices for the old men whose joints had begun to fail. She birthed 2 babies in the dead of the cold months, a girl in the blacksmith's loft and a boy in the weaver's cottage, and both had come into the world breathing easy and pink. The villagers had begun to bring her gifts she had not asked for. A jar of honey, a bundle of dried mint, a pair of woolen mittens, knitted by a grandmother whose grandchild Wren had pulled back from a fever that had taken 3 other children that month. She accepted them all with quiet thanks, and she ate her meals alone, and she did not let anyone pass the threshold of the cottage at the end of Mill Lane, especially not at night. At night, Wren stood in the small back room of the cottage with both hands pressed flat against the wall, and she breathed through the burning in her wrist that had not stopped since the night she had run from Hollowmere. She had examined the mark 100 times by candlelight. By every law of wolf kind she had ever been taught, it should have faded. A mating bond rejected was a mating bond severed. The moon did not permit such things to linger. Within a fortnight at most, the mark of a faithless mate should pale to nothing more than an old scar, and within a season, even the scar should disappear. Hers had darkened. In the months since the gala, the mark on the inside of her left wrist had deepened from a soft silver to a burnished bronze, and on the worst nights, it glowed faintly in the dark. She had taken to wrapping a strip of linen around her wrist at all hours, and she had begun to wear long sleeves even when the fire was high. She did not understand what was happening. She did not want to understand. To understand would be to hope, and to hope would be to die. Her belly had grown round and heavy beneath her aprons. The midwife who lived 2 villages over had ridden out to see her in the 2nd month and had laid her hands gently on Wren's stomach and told her, with the careful tone of a woman who had delivered too many children to be wrong, that she felt 2 heartbeats. 2. Wren had wept that night until the candle burned down. She had wept for the children who would never know their father. She had wept for the man she had loved, who had stood in a ballroom and given his vow to another woman. She had wept for the girl she had been only 6 months ago, the girl who had still believed that love was enough, and she had buried that girl somewhere along the road north, in a snowdrift, with her old name. And then she had risen the next morning and brewed tea for the cooper's daughter, and she had not wept again. That was the Wren who walked out of the cottage on the first true day of the thaw, with a basket on her arm, intending only to gather the wild garlic that came up early in the meadow beyond the lane. It was the children she heard first, a clatter of small boots on the wet road, voices high and breathless. Wren turned, basket in hand, and saw the blacksmith's youngest girl racing toward her with her braid coming loose and her face flushed pink. "Mistress Wren, Mistress Wren, the tinker says." "Slow down, little one." Wren caught the girl's shoulder and steadied her. "Breathe." "The tinker." The girl gulped air. "He came up from Greyford. He says there are riders on the southern road, riders with the mark." "What mark?" The girl's eyes were huge. "The wolf and the crown." The basket slipped from Wren's hand and tumbled into the mud. The wolf and the crown was not a sigil of any house she knew. It was not the mark of House Verith, whose shield bore 3 black ravens. It was not the mark of House Aithwen, whose banners showed a silver doe. The wolf and the crown belonged only to one being in the entire kingdom, and that being had not ridden south of the Iron Mountains in 11 years, the Alpha King of the North. "How many riders?" Wren heard herself ask. Her voice sounded very far away. The tinker said 20. Maybe more. He said they were stopping at every village and asking for a woman. The world tilted. "What kind of woman?" Wren whispered. The blacksmith's daughter looked up at her with wide, solemn eyes and repeated the words she had clearly been told to remember. "A young woman, dark hair, with child, carrying a stone pendant that she will not let anyone touch." Wren's hand went, without her permission, to her throat. The pendant lay there beneath the linen of her dress, the pale river stone on its leather cord. The only thing in the world that was hers and hers alone, the only thing she had not been able to bear to bury or sell or leave behind. The thing no one in the world had any reason to know about. No one except the man she had loved, who had once asked her on a summer night in an orchard what the symbol on the stone meant, and who had promised, with his lips against her wrist, that he would never tell another living soul. Wren stood in the mud at the edge of Mill Lane with her hand at her throat and her 2 children stirring in her belly, and she understood, with a cold and terrible clarity, that someone she had once loved had broken his only promise, and that the Alpha King of the North was looking for her. She did not run. That was the first surprise of the night, and it surprised no one more than Wren herself. She had thought, all through the 4 months of her exile, that the moment any rider with any sigil came within a day's ride of Brier Hollow, she would gather her satchel and her pendant and her unborn children and disappear again into the next valley north. She had even chosen the valley. She had memorized the path. But when the blacksmith's daughter ran back toward the village square, and Wren bent and picked up her muddy basket and walked back into her cottage and closed the door, she did not pack. She sat down in the small wooden chair by the hearth, and she pressed both hands flat against the curve of her belly, and she felt the children move beneath her palms in the way they had begun to do that month, 2 pairs of feet pushing in 2 different directions, as if they were already arguing. And she thought about the pendant. She had not understood, that summer evening in the orchard, what the symbol on the stone meant. Her mother had given it to her on her 7th birthday, 3 years before she died, and she had told Sable only that it had belonged to her mother before her, and her mother before her, and that she should keep it close, and never speak of it to anyone outside their blood. Sable had been a child. She had not asked questions. She had worn it under her dress and forgotten about it for years at a time, and only after her mother died and her father drank himself to ruin and the cousin had passed her off to the kitchens of House Verith had she begun to wear it again, the way one wears a saint's medal, for comfort. She had let Calum see it once, only once. He had lifted it from her collarbone with the back of one finger, and his face had gone very still, and he had asked her where it had come from. She had told him. She had told him because she had loved him, and because she had not believed there was anything in the world she could not tell him. Now, sitting in her cottage at the end of Mill Lane, she understood that she had given her one secret to a man who had given his vow to another woman. And she understood, with the slow, cold horror of a person watching an ice floe break beneath their feet, that whatever was happening to her now had begun the moment she opened her mouth. There was a knock at the door. Wren did not rise. The knock came again. Not loud, not impatient. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wood. "Mistress," a man's voice, older than she had expected and gentler. "I know you are within. I felt your heart settle when you sat down." Wren's hand went to the iron poker by the hearth. "I have not come to harm you," the voice said. "I have come because a man I have served for 30 years will lose what is left of his mind if I do not bring him news of you before the moon turns again. I will not enter unless you bid me, but I would ask you, very humbly, to open the door." Wren rose. The poker trembled in her hand. She crossed the small room and stood with her palm flat against the wood, and she said through the door, the only thing she could think to say, "I do not know any king." There was a long silence on the other side. "No, mistress," the voice said at last, very softly, "but he knows you." She opened the door. The man on her threshold was tall and lean, with hair the color of iron and a beard cropped close to a face that had been weathered by long travel. He wore a heavy traveling cloak the color of wet slate, and beneath it she could see the dark leather of a soldier's coat. But he wore no sword. His hands were open, palms out, in the old gesture of a wolf who comes in peace. Behind him, in the lane, 2 other men sat their horses at a respectful distance, their faces hooded against the wind. The old man inclined his head. "My name is Rowan Caradoc," he said. "I am first hand to the Alpha King of the North. I have ridden 11 days to find you." "You have made an error," Ren said. "I have not. My name is Ren. I am a healer. I know nothing of kings." Rowan Caradoc looked at her, and his eyes, a very pale and tired gray, moved from her face to the linen wrapped around her left wrist, and then to the curve of her belly beneath her apron, and finally to the small lump beneath her collar where the pendant lay against her skin. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone very quiet. "Mistress," he said, "the woman my king is searching for bears a mark on the inside of her left wrist that should have faded in a fortnight and has not. She carries a child that should not exist by any law of his kind. And she wears, around her neck, a stone that has not been seen above ground in this kingdom for 400 years. The blood went out of Ren's face. "You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying. That stone is my mother's." "That stone," Rowan Caradoc said gently, "was your mother's, and her mother's before her, and so on back through 9 generations of women whose names have been struck from every record in the southern provinces by the order of a council that wanted them forgotten." He paused. "May I come in, mistress? What I have to tell you cannot be said on a doorstep." Ren did not remember stepping aside. She did not remember crossing back to the chair by the hearth and lowering herself into it. She remembered only the sound of her own pulse in her ears and the way her children had gone suddenly, attentively still beneath her ribs, as if even they were listening. Rowan Caradoc closed the door behind him. He did not sit. He stood by the small window with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the muddy lane outside, and he spoke as if he were reciting a thing he had rehearsed for a very long time. "On the night of the engagement gala at Hollowmere Manor," he said, "my king rode 2 days through a winter storm to attend a ceremony to which he had not been invited. He stood at the western window of the upper gallery and watched the ballroom. He had come because 3 nights before, in his own keep, 400 miles to the north, he had woken at the same hour every night with a pain in his chest, like a knife being driven inward, and he had not been able to sleep, and he had not been able to eat. And on the 3rd night he had gone to the old seer in the village beneath his fortress, and demanded that she tell him what was happening to him." Rowan Caradoc's voice did not shake, but his hands, behind his back, had closed into fists. The seer told him that somewhere in the southern provinces, a true mate bond was being forged in violence, a bond not his own. She told him that the woman at the heart of it was being hunted, and that if he did not ride south and find her before the next moon, she would die, and the line that ran in her blood would die with her. Ren could not breathe. "He rode the next morning," Rowan Caradoc said. "He rode 2 days. He stood at the western window of Hollowmere and waited for a face he had never seen, and instead, he watched a young man in a storm-gray coat speak a vow to a woman in a cream-colored gown, and he watched a shadow on the eastern gallery turn and run." Rowan Caradoc turned at last to look at her. "My king never saw your face that night, mistress. He saw only the strip of silk you tore on the doorway. He has been searching for you ever since. He has searched 7 provinces. He has questioned 40 villages. He has slept perhaps 2 hours of every night in 4 months." The old man's pale eyes were very steady. "He does not know who you are. He does not know your name. He knows only that the bond that woke in his chest on the 3rd night before that gala has not faded since, and that wherever you are alive, and that he will find you, or he will lose what is left of himself trying. Wren pressed her fist against her mouth. There is more, mistress. I cannot. You must hear it. Please. The man who spoke the vow that night, Rowan Caradoc said, did not speak it of his own will. The room went very still. There is a poison, he said, older than this kingdom, brewed from a moss that grows only in the deep caves of the western coast. It severs a wolf from his wolf for the span of 3 days. It hollows him out and leaves the shape of him behind, and during those 3 days, he can be made to speak, to move, to vow, to sign, to do anything required of him, and when he wakes, he remembers none of it. Rowan Caradoc paused. My king has had the cup tested. He has had the boy tested. He has had 3 witnesses interrogated. The young heir of House Werewolf was poisoned with the moss draught on the morning of his engagement gala by someone within his own household, and he woke 3 days later with no memory of the woman whose hand he had taken. Wren made a sound she did not recognize as her own. He came back to himself on the 3rd dawn after the gala. Rowan Caradoc said quietly, He has been searching for you ever since. He has not found you because his enemies have hidden you better than he has hunted, and because they have ridden with the mark of House Werewolf into every village he has searched, telling the villagers that they are looking for a runaway servant girl who has stolen from her master. Wren bent forward over her belly and pressed both hands against her mouth. The room blurred. And the woman in the cream gown, Rowan Caradoc said, and his voice had at last gone hard. The woman whose hand he took. Mistress, I am very sorry to tell you this. The poisoning was not done without her knowledge. The poisoning was arranged by her. Through the roaring in her ears, Wren heard him draw something from inside his coat. She heard the soft whisper of paper. She heard him cross the room, slowly, and crouch down in front of her chair. And she felt him press a folded parchment into her trembling hand. This was intercepted 9 days ago, Rowan Caradoc said, by a courier in my king's service who has since paid for the interception with his life. It is written in the hand of Marisol Aithwen, sealed with the silver dough of her house, and addressed to a man in the southern provinces, whose name we know, but will not speak in this room. Wren unfolded the parchment with hands that did not feel like her own. The handwriting was Marisol's. She would have known it anywhere. The same hand that had once written her little notes from across the kitchens, the same loops, the same spidery slant. The note was 3 lines long. The kitchen girl is in Brier Hollow. She carries the brat. End them both before the new moon. The price is doubled if the bodies are never found. The parchment fell from Wren's fingers. Outside, in the muddy lane, one of the horses screamed. Rowan Caradoc was on his feet before the sound had finished. His hand went to the long knife at his belt that Wren had not seen him wearing, and his pale eyes had gone, in the space of a heartbeat, the color of old amber. Mistress, he said, very low, get behind me. From the trees at the end of Mill Lane, where the wild garlic grew, a slow gray shape detached itself from the shadows. Then another, then a third. And from somewhere beyond them, at the dark edge of the whispering pines, a hunting horn sounded a single low note, and the children in Wren's belly kicked, hard and frightened, against the inside of her ribs. Wren rose from the chair before she knew she had decided to. The parchment lay on the floor at her feet. The fire in the hearth had burned low. Outside, the second horse screamed, and the sound cut off in a way that horses' sounds were not meant to cut off, and Wren understood, without being told, that one of Rowan Caradoc's 2 riders was already dead in the lane. Stay behind me, Rowan said again. He did not turn his head. There is a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, Wren said. Her voice came out steadier than she had thought it would. The trap is hidden under the rag rug. It will not save me, but it will buy you a moment. It is not for buying me a moment that I need it, mistress. Then for what? For the children. Wren's hand pressed flat against her belly. Outside, in the muddy lane, a man's voice rose in a short, barked command. 3 voices answered. Wren could not make out the words, but she heard the shape of them, and the shape was the shape of men who had done this work before, and who were arranging themselves around the cottage with the unhurried confidence of professionals. The Vendron family of the southern provinces, Rowan had not said aloud, did not employ amateurs. He did not need to say it. The handwriting on the floor had said it for him. Mistress? Rowan Caradoc's pale eyes flicked once toward her. How many windows in this cottage? 3. The front, the kitchen, and the one above the pallet. The one above the pallet faces the trees? Yes. That is the one they will come through. The front is for show. They want us watching the door. He had drawn a second knife from inside his coat without her noticing. He held one in each hand now, easy and low. When the glass breaks, you go for the cellar. Do not stop. Do not look back. If you hear my voice, you stay where you are. If you hear any other voice, you stay where you are. Do you understand? I understand. Mistress? Yes. The pendant. Take it off. Wren's hand flew to her throat. Take it off, he said again, and hold it in your fist. Do not let them see it. Do not let them touch it. If they take it from you, everything we have done tonight is for nothing. She did not ask why. There was no time. She lifted the leather cord over her head with shaking fingers, and the pale river stone settled cold and heavy into her palm. The moment her skin closed around it, the burning in her wrist eased, just a little, as if the stone had drawn some of the heat into itself. A pane of glass exploded inward above the pallet. Wren ran for the cellar. She heard the first body land on the wooden floor behind her. She heard Rowan Caradoc move with a speed that belonged to no man his age, the sharp, wet sound of his knife finding its mark, the crash of a body folding against the wall. She did not look. The rag rug had already been kicked aside in her flight. She dropped to her knees, fumbled the iron ring of the trap door, hauled it upward against the weight of her belly, and went down the short ladder into the dark. The trap fell shut over her head. For a long moment there was nothing but her own ragged breathing and the dirt-cold air of the cellar and the dim light leaking through the cracks in the boards above. Wren pressed her back to the cold earth wall and clutched the pendant against her chest, and she listened. There were 3 of them in the cottage now. She could hear their boots. She could hear Rowan breathing in short, hard sips of air, the way a man breathes when he has taken a wound and is not letting on. She could hear the kettle on the hearth get knocked askew and clatter to the stones. She could hear, very faintly, a 4th voice from outside the cottage, calling instructions. The cellar, the 4th voice said. Calm, almost bored. There will be a cellar, find it. Wren's heart slammed against her ribs. A boot passed directly over her head. Dust sifted down through the cracks and settled in her hair. She did not breathe. She did not move. The boot paused, turned a slow half-circle, and paused again. A second boot joined it. Here. A man's voice, thick with the accent of the southern provinces. The rug was kicked. Look at the dirt, she went under. Open it. The old man. We'll be dead in another minute. Open the cellar. There was a heavy, soft sound from above. The old man going down to one knee, perhaps. A grunt of effort. Then the trapdoor above Wren's head shuddered, and she understood with a cold clarity that they were going to lift it, and that when they did, she would have no more than the time it took to draw breath before a knife or an arrow or a hand came down on her. She closed her fist around the pendant. She did not pray. She had stopped praying somewhere along the road north. Instead, she did the thing she had not done in 15 years, the thing her mother had made her practice every night for the 3 years before she died, the thing Sable had thought, all this time, was only a child's game. She breathed in, and she said the 4 words her mother had taught her, in the language Sable had never understood, and had never been told the meaning of. The pendant grew warm in her hand. Above her, the trap door came open. The man who had bent to lift it was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a wolf's amber eyes and a fresh cut across his jaw where Rowan had marked him. He looked down into the cellar, and his eyes met Wren's, and he opened his mouth to call to the others. He did not get the chance. The pale river stone in Wren's fist flared. Light came out of her palm. Not the cool moonlight of a wolf shift, not the warm gold of a hearth fire. A clean white light, the color of the inside of a shell, the color of the sky just before snow. It poured up out of her closed hand and through the open trap, and struck the man above her in the chest, and he made a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. A sound like a man waking from a dream he had not known he was inside, and he fell backward away from the trap door without a cry. Wren stared at her own fist. The pendant pulsed against her palm like a second heart. Something her mother had said to her once on a winter evening when the wind was high and Sable had been small enough to sit on her mother's lap, came back to her now with the force of a struck bell. You are not what they will tell you. You are. You are not a kitchen girl. You are not a healer's daughter. You are the last in a line of women who could put their hands on the world and ask it to listen. One day, my love, the world will ask you back. Be ready. Wren had laughed because she had been 6 years old, and her mother had only smiled and tucked her hair behind her ear and had never explained. Wren closed her eyes for one long heartbeat. Then she climbed the ladder. Rowan Caradoc was on his knees by the hearth when her head cleared the trap. 2 men lay dead at his feet. A third man, the one who had opened the trap, lay sprawled on the floorboards with his eyes wide open and breathing in the slow, stunned way of a man who could not remember his own name. Rowan had a hand pressed to his side. Blood had soaked through his coat in a wide, dark patch and was running between his fingers onto the stones of the floor. He looked up at Wren as she came out of the cellar, and his face changed. Mistress, he whispered. There is one more outside, she said. Mistress, your eyes. Rowan, your eyes are white. There is one more outside. He gave the orders. He has not come in because he is waiting to see who comes out. Rowan Caradoc looked at her for a long moment, and Wren did not know what he saw. But she saw his throat work, and she saw something move in his face that was not fear and not awe, and not quite either, but a thing that held a little of both. Then we will not give him what he is waiting for, Rowan said. He put one bloody hand on the floor and pushed himself up. Stay behind me. We are going out the back. You are bleeding. I have bled before. Rowan, mistress. He turned his head, and his pale eyes met hers, and they were very clear. If we wait inside this cottage, more will come. They will come with archers and with fire, and your light will not save you from a roof that has been set alight from the outside. We go out the back. We make the trees. The man my king sent with me, the second rider, his horse may still be alive in the lane, and if it is not, there are wild horses in the lower meadow that I can call. He paused. Can you ride? I can ride. Even now, I can ride. Then come. The back door of the cottage opened onto a narrow strip of garden where Wren had been growing winter cabbages, and beyond that, a low stone wall, and beyond that, the dark line of the whispering pines. Rowan went first, low and fast, his knife in his uninjured hand. Wren came after him with the pendant clutched against her chest and one hand pressed beneath her belly to support its weight. The cold air bit at her face. The mud sucked at her slippers. She had not had time to put on her boots, and she did not care. They were at the stone wall when the fourth man stepped out from behind it. He was younger than Wren had expected, and unmasked. A clean-shaven face, fair hair tied back, a long traveling coat. He did not look like an assassin. He looked like a clerk. The crossbow in his hands, however, was not a clerk's, and the bolt set into it gleamed dully in the moonlight with the dark sheen of something that had been steeped in poison. First Hand of the North, the young man said pleasantly. I have been told to take you alive if convenient. I have been told to take her alive at any cost. He raised the crossbow. Rowan Caradoc stepped between Wren and the bolt without seeming to move. Run, mistress, he said quietly. Wren did not run. The pendant in her fist had gone hot. White light leaked between her fingers in thin, bright lines. Without thinking, without deciding, without even knowing what she meant to do, she opened her hand and held the stone out toward the young man with the crossbow, the way one holds a candle out into a dark room. The light did not strike him. It struck the bolt. The poisoned tip of the crossbow bolt flared white. The young man's eyes went wide. He pulled the trigger by reflex and the bolt loosed, and the light traveled up the length of it as it flew. And when it struck Rowan Caradoc in the shoulder, it struck without poison, without venom, without any of the things that should have killed him in the breath that followed. Rowan grunted. He went to one knee. The young man stared at his crossbow. What? He said. Did you just do? Wren did not answer. She did not know. A howl rose from the direction of the whispering pines. It was not a wolf's hunting howl. Wren had heard those in the long winter nights at Hollowmere, when the household wolves ran the eastern woods. This was something else. A howl with a voice in it. A howl with a word in it. Though Wren could not have said what the word was, only that it cut through the cold air like a blade, and that the young man with the crossbow heard it, and that the color went out of his face. He did not wait to see what was coming. He turned and ran. He made it perhaps 20 paces before the thing came out of the trees. Wren had thought, standing on the eastern gallery at Hollowmere 4 months ago, that she had seen the largest wolf a man could become. She had been wrong. The shape that broke from the line of the whispering pines was bigger than any wolf had a right to be. Its fur was the deep silver black of wet slate, and its eyes burned a color Wren had never seen on a living thing, a green so pale it was almost white, a green like the inside of a glacier. It did not hunt the young man with the crossbow. It did not need to. It ran past him, ran through him as if he were not there at all, ran in a long, low lope that ate the distance between the pines and the stone wall. And the young man fell behind it, fell quietly, fell with no scream and no sound, and only the soft impact of a body folding into the mud. The wolf came on. It stopped 6 feet from the wall. It did not approach Wren. It looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The pale green eyes held her. The great chest rose and fell. The breath of the creature steamed in the cold air, and Wren could see the slow movement of muscle beneath its silver-black coat, and she could feel something through the open palm of her hand, something traveling along the line of light from the pendant, something searching, and finding. The bond in her wrist, the bond she had thought was a wound, the bond she had thought belonged to a boy in a storm-gray coat who had spoken a vow to another woman, lit up beneath her sleeve like a struck match. It was not the same bond. The realization hit Wren so hard she put her hand on the stone wall to keep from going down. It was not the same bond. The thing that had burned in her wrist for 4 months was not the mark Calum had given her in the orchard. The mark Calum had given her had faded. She understood that now, with a clarity that arrived all at once. The mark on her wrist now, the mark that had darkened to bronze, the mark that had glowed faintly in the dark, was a different mark, a second mark, a mark that had been laid over the first one, the way a deeper ink is laid over a fading one, and that had been growing into her skin for 4 months without her knowing. A mark she had not consented to and did not remember receiving. A mark that belonged to the wolf standing in the lane. The wolf took one slow step forward. It did not shift. It did not speak. It simply lowered its great head until its breath was warm on the back of her hand, and it pressed its broad nose, very gently, against the inside of her left wrist. The mark answered. A pulse of warmth ran up her arm, into her chest, down into her belly, where the children kicked once, hard, in unison, and went still. "Oh," Wren whispered. "Oh no." The wolf raised its head. The pale green eyes held hers for one more long heartbeat. Then it turned, with the slow, deliberate grace of a creature making sure it was followed, and it began to walk back toward the whispering pines. Behind her, Rowan Caradoc made a soft sound that might have been a laugh. "Mistress," he said, from the ground, "I think my king wishes you to come with him." Wren did not follow the wolf. She stood with her hand on the cold stone wall and she watched the silver-black shape walk away from her into the dark. And she felt the children stir again beneath her ribs, and the only thing she could think, with a strange numb clarity, was that she had been a fool. She had been a fool for 4 months. She had been a fool to believe she was running from one wound when she had been carrying 2. She had been a fool to believe the burn in her wrist was Calum, when Calum's mark had faded the night she had fled, and the new mark had settled in over it before the 3rd dawn. She had been a fool to believe, for one single second of those 4 months, that the dreams she had been having of pale green eyes in a forest she did not recognize were only dreams. The wolf paused at the edge of the trees. It looked back over its shoulder. "Rowan," Wren said, without turning her head. "Stand up." "Mistress, you are bleeding through your coat. Stand up, or I cannot help you." There was a pause behind her, and then the slow, scraping sound of an old soldier dragging himself to his feet against a stone wall. Wren went to him without looking at the wolf, and she put her hand against the patch of blood on his side, and she let the pendant brush the cloth. The white light pulsed once, soft. Rowan made a small, surprised sound, and the bleeding stopped. "Mistress," he said again, very quietly, "I do not know what I am doing." "I think perhaps you do." "I have never done it before tonight." "I do not believe that is entirely true." She did not answer. She closed her hand around the pendant and turned at last, and she walked across the muddy garden toward the line of pines, and the wolf waited for her, and Rowan Caradoc walked behind her with his bloodless hand pressed to a wound that had stopped bleeding and a look on his face she could not read. The wolf led them perhaps a quarter of a mile into the trees, to a clearing Wren had never known existed, where a small fire burned low between 2 fallen logs, and 4 horses stood tethered and watching, and a man in a long, dark coat sat on the larger of the 2 logs with his head bent over his folded hands, and his hair the color of wet stone falling forward across his face. He looked up when they entered the clearing. He was not what Wren had expected. She had pictured, in the few moments she had allowed herself to picture anything, a man like Calum's father. Silver-bearded, heavy-jowled. The kind of wolf king who had ruled the northern provinces for so long that the ruling had begun to show on him. The man on the log was not old. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a little older. He had a clean, hard jaw and a mouth that looked as if it had not smiled in months, and his eyes, in the firelight, were the same pale green Wren had just seen in the wolf's, and she understood as he rose to his feet that the wolf had not led her to her king. The wolf had been her king. He did not come toward her. He stood very still on his side of the fire, with his hands open at his sides, and he looked at her across the small distance the way a man looks at a thing he has been told he is not allowed to touch. "Mistress," he said. His voice was quieter than she had expected. Lower. There was a roughness to it, the roughness of a man who had been speaking too little for too long. "I do not know your name," he said. "No. I have been told you call yourself Wren." "I do." "Is it the name your mother gave you?" "It was her name," Wren said. "Not mine." He absorbed that without moving. The pale green eyes did not leave her face. "My name is Halric Vorn," he said. "I am the Alpha King of the 7 northern provinces, the Lord of the Whispering Pines, and the holder of a bond I did not ask for, and did not understand, and would not, if I had been asked, have laid against the wrist of a woman I had never seen. He paused. I am very sorry. Wren stared at him. It was not what she had expected him to say. You did not ask for it? No? Then how is it on me? Halric Vorn looked down at his open hands. He turned them once, slowly, palm up to palm down, as if he were not entirely sure they belonged to him. There is a thing, he said, that happens to my line, perhaps once in 3 generations, perhaps once in 5. We do not speak of it. The seers in the village beneath my fortress know of it. The old wolves know of it. We do not write it down. It is the reason my line has been kept clean for 900 years, and the reason the 4 kings before me died without heirs. He looked up. It is called the other mark. It comes when a wolf of my blood meets, even at a distance, even unknowing, a woman of a certain old line. The mark is laid by the wolf without his consent, and it is received by the woman without her consent, and once it is laid, it cannot be undone. You did not meet me. I did. I would remember. You would not. I did not. Until the seer told me. You came once, 4 years ago, with the household of House Varith to a midsummer council at the keep of my younger brother in the Middle Provinces. You were one of 3 girls sent up from the kitchens to carry the wine. You were 16 years old. You would not have looked at me. I would not have looked at you. The mark does not require looking. It requires only proximity and a recognition between 2 old lines that the wearers themselves do not know they carry. Wren put her hand against the trunk of the nearest pine. 4 years, she said. Yes. 4 years? The mark sleeps until it is needed. It wakes when the woman it was laid upon is in mortal danger. It wakes, in our oldest stories, on the night a daughter of the line is widowed or orphaned or betrayed or hunted. He paused. It woke in me 3 nights before the gala at Hollowmere. Wren closed her eyes. The seer told you, she said, to ride south. Yes. She told you a true mate bond was being forged in violence. She did. It was not yours. No. It was Calem's. Halric Vorn was silent for a moment. I understood that, he said carefully, when I stood at the western window and saw the boy speak the vow. I understood that my mark was not the mate mark. The mate mark belonged to the boy in the storm-gray coat. My mark was the other thing, the older thing, the thing that does not ask to exist. He looked at her. I had ridden 2 days to find a woman I did not know. I had stood in a window and watched her run from a man who had been poisoned into betraying her. I had felt her grief through a bond I had not asked to carry, and I had ridden out of that house and started searching, because the seer had told me that if I did not, you would die. And the mate mark? Wren said. Her voice had begun to shake. Calem's mark? Faded the night you ran. It was supposed to? Yes. He has not faded with it. Halric Vorn went very still. What do you mean, mistress? Wren laughed. It came out wrong. It came out thin and high and not like her own laugh, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth to make it stop. I mean, she said, that for 4 months I have been telling myself the burn in my wrist was him. I have been telling myself that the dreams I have been having were him. I have been telling myself that the man who climbed through my window every night and pressed his hand against my belly and whispered that he loved me, in a language that was not the language I speak in the day, was him. I have been grieving him for 4 months. She was crying now. She had not noticed when she began. And he was never there at all. He was never in the dreams. He was gone the night I ran, and the man who was in my dreams was you. And I did not know your face, and I did not know your name. And I have been mourning a man who stopped loving me 4 months ago, while a man I had never met was the one whose voice I was hearing in the dark. Halric Vorn did not move. His face did not change. But Wren saw, very clearly in the firelight, that his hands had begun to shake at his sides. "Mistress," he said after a long moment, "I have come to take you north. I have come to take you to my fortress, where you will be safe, where the Vendron house cannot reach you, where the Athwin woman cannot reach you, where you will be guarded by my own pack until your children are born and beyond. I have come to keep you alive." He paused. "I have not come to claim a bond you did not consent to. The mark on your wrist will fade, in time, if it is not answered. It will hurt, but it will fade. You owe me nothing, mistress. You owe my house nothing. You owe my line nothing. The mark was laid without your knowledge, and I will not hold you to it. You will not hold me to it. No. You will simply let it fade." "Yes." Wren laughed again, the same wrong laugh. "And the dreams?" she said. He did not answer. "And the dreams," she said again, "in which you came to me every night, in which you told me you loved me, in which you said my name in a language I do not speak, in which you held me when I wept, and I held you when you wept. Because you were weeping, weren't you? In those dreams, you were weeping for a woman you did not know and had not found. Will those simply fade as well?" Halric Vorn closed his eyes. "Mistress, please, answer me." "I cannot answer you." "Why not?" "Because if I answer you," he said, "I will say a thing I came here promising myself I would not say." "Say it, mistress. Say it, Halric Vorne." He opened his eyes. In the firelight, the pale green had gone almost gold, the way a frozen pond goes gold beneath a low sun, and Wren saw in his face, very plainly, the man who had been on his knees in the dark for 4 months, reaching for a woman through a bond he had not asked for, and she saw in his face also the man who would walk back to his fortress alone if she told him to. "I love you," Halric Vorne said. "I have loved you since the 3rd night before the gala. I do not know you. I do not know your true name. I do not know the color of your eyes in daylight or the shape of your laugh, or what you take in your tea, or whether you sing when you are alone. I love you anyway. I have loved you through a bond I did not lay and do not deserve. I will love you whether you come north with me or you do not. I will love you whether you speak to me again after tonight or you do not. The mark will fade. The love will not." He drew a long breath. "There. I have said it. Now please come north. The Vendron house has tracked you to this village, and they will come again. And I cannot hold this clearing for more than another hour." The fire snapped between them. Wren looked at him across it. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, of a girl in a midnight blue gown who had stood on a balcony 4 months ago and waited for a man to look up at her. She thought of how that girl had run. She thought of how she had not been the same girl since. "I am not coming north because of the mark," she said. "I know. I am coming north because there are men in this kingdom who want to put a poisoned bolt into my children, and you have horses, and I do not." "I know, mistress." "And because I would like to know," she said, more quietly, "what color your eyes are in daylight." Halric Vorn looked at her for a very long moment. He did not smile, but something in his face eased, the way a held breath eases, and he inclined his head. Very slightly, the old wolf gesture of a king accepting a gift from a hand he had not dared to ask. "North, then," he said. They rode out of the whispering pines at the low gray hour before dawn. Halric Vorn did not put Wren on her own horse. He had brought a mare for her, a steady russet-coated thing with a long, patient face. But he led the mare unmounted at the back of their column, and he set Wren on the saddle in front of him on his own black stallion, with a heavy fur-lined cloak draped over both their shoulders and his arm wrapped low and careful around her waist, where the children rode. "You are exhausted, mistress," he had said, when she had tried to refuse. "You have not slept. You have lost blood. The roads are not even, And a fall from a saddle at this stage is not a fall a healer can mend. Ride with me, or ride in a litter, and we cannot afford the slowness of a litter. Choose. She had chosen. The first hour of the ride passed in silence. Wren sat very stiffly against him at first, holding her own weight off his chest, her spine a rigid line beneath the cloak. The cold was bitter. The road was rough. The children were awake in her belly and turning slowly, and the steady rocking of the horse under her was making her sick. But she did not lean back. She would not lean back. She did not know yet what she felt about the man behind her, and she was unwilling to teach her body the shape of him before her mind had caught up. He did not press her. He did not speak. He held her steady on the saddle with a hand that did not touch her any more than was needed to keep her upright, and he watched the road over her shoulder, and the 4 wolves of his guard ran in a wide loose ring around them through the trees on either side, silent as smoke. It was Rowan Caradoc, riding at her left, who broke the silence at last. "You will not believe me, mistress," he said, "but he has been like this since I have known him." Like what? Quiet, patient, apologetic, when there was nothing he had done to apologize for. Rowan kept his eyes on the road. "He was raised in a great deal of grief, my king. His mother was killed in a border raid when he was 11. His brother, the one you were brought before in the Middle Provinces, drowned 6 years ago in a flooded river. The keep he holds now belonged to his father, and his father was not a kind man. He has spent a great deal of his life learning not to take up more space than he is owed." Wren was silent. "I tell you this," Rowan said, "because he will not." "You speak very freely, firsthand." "I speak freely because I have ridden behind him for 30 years, and I have never seen him as he is tonight. And if I do not speak now, I am not certain I will have another chance." Halrick's voice came quietly from behind her. "Rowan, my king, you may stop speaking. My king." Rowan subsided, but Wren caught beneath her shoulder the faintest movement of Halrick's chest that might have been the suppressed beginning of a laugh. After a while, against her will, she let her spine soften by a degree, then by another. By the second hour she had let her shoulder rest, very lightly, against the front of his coat, and the warmth of him beneath the wool was so unexpected and so unlike the cold that had lived in her since the night of the gala that she could not bring herself to pull away again. Halrick did not comment. She thought he had perhaps stopped breathing for a moment. When he spoke at last, hours later, the sky had begun to pale toward a true gray, and the road had begun to climb into the foothills that marked the edge of the southern provinces. The wolves of his guard had drawn in closer. The danger was not yet behind them. It would not be behind them, Wren understood, until they had crossed the Iron Mountains, and that was 3 days' ride at the pace they could risk with a woman in her 6th month on the saddle. "Mistress," Halrick said, "may I ask you something?" "Yes." "In the dreams." He paused. "Did I frighten you?" The question caught her so completely by surprise that for a moment she could not answer. "No," she said. "You did not frighten me. I did not know I was visiting you. I thought perhaps the dreams were only mine. If I had known a real woman was on the other side of them, I would have been more careful." "More careful how?" "I would not have wept in front of you." Wren felt her chest tighten. "You wept the second time," she said. "On the riverbank. There was a riverbank. You were sitting on a stone, and the water was dark. And I came up behind you, and I did not know who you were, and I put my hand on your shoulder, and you turned, and you wept against my dress. I remember. You said you had lost something. I had. You said you did not know how to find it. I did not. And then you took my hand," Wren said, "and you pressed it against your face, and you said—" She stopped. "I said," Halrick said quietly, "if you are real, do not let me wake." Wren closed her eyes. The horse moved beneath them. The cold air moved past them. Somewhere, far ahead in the foothills, a hawk cried twice and was silent. "I thought," she said, "that I was making you up. I thought it was the grief. I thought I had become so lonely that I had begun to invent a kind man in the dark. I thought, when the dreams went on getting more real, that I was losing my mind. You were not. I know that now. Mistress. Yes. What did I call you? In the dreams?" She had not meant to tell him. She had meant to keep that one thing to herself, the way a person keeps one warm coal at the bottom of a long cold hearth, in case she ever needed to start a fire again. But his arm was around her in the cold, and his chest was warm against her shoulder, and he had asked the question without expecting an answer, and she found that she could not refuse him. "You called me Sable." His breath caught against the top of her head. "That is your name?" It was. "You did not give it to anyone." "No." And yet, in the dreams, I knew it. Yes. "How?" "I do not know," Wren said. "Perhaps the mark knew. Perhaps the children knew. Perhaps somewhere between us, in the dark, there was a thing that knew us better than we knew ourselves." Halric did not answer. His hand at her waist, very slowly, opened. She felt his palm flatten against the front of her cloak, against the shape of her belly beneath, and she felt one of the children turn, lazily, and press a small foot directly into the heel of his hand. He made a sound she had not heard him make. It was not loud. It was not even, perhaps, fully voiced. But she felt it travel through his chest into her shoulder, and she understood that the man behind her had just received, in silence, the first true confirmation that the children inside her were going to live. "Sable," he said. "Yes. My name in the dreams. Did you know it?" "No." "What did you call me?" She thought back, for a long moment, through the long warm corridor of those dreams that she had thought were only grief. "I never called you anything," she said slowly. "I did not need to. You were always the only one there." His arm tightened around her, very gently, and did not let her go. They rode another mile in silence. When they crested the next ridge and looked down across the valley below them, the smile that had begun to soften the corner of Halric Vorn's mouth went out as if a candle had been pinched. A column of black smoke rose from the valley floor. It rose from the place where a small market town should have stood, the last town on this side of the foothills. The town where they had planned to stop for fresh horses and a quarter of an hour's rest in a warm room before pushing on through the pass. The town was burning. "Rowan," Halric said, very softly. "My king. How many of them?" Rowan Caradoc had drawn his horse up alongside theirs. His pale eyes were on the smoke, and the lines of his face had gone hard in the way only a very old soldier's face goes hard. "To burn a town that size," he said, "in the time we have been on the road, they would need at least 60, perhaps 80. They would need to have ridden ahead of us. They would need to have known we were coming." They knew. "Yes, my king." "Marisol," Wren whispered. Halric's arm did not move from her waist, but his other hand, the hand that had been holding the reins, had closed into a fist so tight that the leather creaked. "It is not Marisol Aethwen alone who knew our road," he said. "It is not the Vendron house alone who could move that many riders that fast. There is a third hand in this, mistress. There has always been a third hand. I have suspected it for 2 months, and I have not been able to find it." He looked down at the burning town. "I think we are about to." "What do we do?" "We do not go down." "Halric, there will be people," he said quietly, "in that town who are still alive. There will be children. There will be wounded. I know what I am asking when I tell you we do not go down. I am asking you to be the kind of queen I do not yet know whether you are willing to be." Wren stared at the smoke. She thought of the blacksmith's daughter at Brier Hollow, who had run up the muddy road with her braid coming loose to bring her a warning that had saved her life. She thought of the herbalist who had wept over the splint. She thought of the miller's wife who had given her a bowl of barley soup on the night she arrived with the cold inside her bones. She thought of every village like Brier Hollow that lay between her and the Iron Mountains. She did not answer Halric directly. She pulled the pendant out from inside her dress, and she let it hang free over the front of her cloak for the first time since she had been 7 years old, and the pale river stone caught the rising light of the dawn and held it like a held breath. "We go down," she said, "but we do not go down to fight them. We go down to put out the fire. Sable. Halric Vorn." She turned her head, just enough to see the side of his face. "You said tonight that you came to keep me alive. I am telling you now that I did not survive 4 months of running by being a woman who watches a town burn from a hill. If you came to keep me alive, then you came to keep all of me alive, and there is a part of me that will not survive sitting on this ridge." For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, very slowly, he turned the great black stallion's head toward the descending road. "Rowan," he said, "send a runner ahead. Tell every soul still alive in that valley that the Queen of the North is coming, and that she is bringing the water with her." "My king. Do it." Rowan Caradoc looked at Ren for one long heartbeat. He inclined his head, very slightly, the same wolf gesture his king had given her in the clearing. Then he wheeled his horse and was gone down the road at a gallop, and the 4 wolves of the guard closed in tight around them, and the column began the long descent into the burning valley. Ren held the pendant in her open hand against the front of her cloak. It was already beginning to glow. The road into the valley smelled of pitch. Ren had thought, at the top of the ridge, that the smoke rising from the town below was the smoke of houses. By the time the column reached the lower switchbacks, she understood that it was not. The market town of Coldreach had been built around a long timber granary, the largest in the southern foothills, and the granary had been fired first, and the fire had been fed with pitch barrels stacked along its walls in a way that no accident could have produced. The wind off the mountains was driving the flames sideways into the cottages along the eastern lane. Halric Vorn reined in 20 paces from the first burning roof. "Rowan," he said quietly. "The wells." "3, my king. North side, south side, and beneath the bell tower." "Sable." "Yes." "Can you do with a well what you did with the bolt?" She looked down at the pendant in her hand. It was already warm. The pale river stone had begun to pulse with that clean white light again, the way a heart pulses when a person has been running, and she did not know what she could and could not do, and she did not have time to learn. "I do not know," she said. "I have not tried." "Then we will try," Halric said. "Together." He swung down from the saddle in one long motion, and he reached up for her, and Ren let him take her by the waist and lift her down. The cold mud of the road was hard beneath her slippers. Halric kept one hand at the small of her back, steadying her, and he did not move his hand even when she had her balance, and Ren did not ask him to. The first survivor reached them as they stepped past the burning sheep pen. It was a girl, perhaps 12 years old. Her hair was singed at one side, and her hands were red, and she was carrying a younger child against her hip, whose breathing was the ragged, shallow breathing of a child who had taken in too much smoke. The girl saw the column of riders and stopped. Her eyes went to Halric first, and to the wolves of his guard, and she opened her mouth to say something, and no words came. Ren went to her without thinking. "Give him to me," she said. The girl shook her head. "Give him to me," Ren said again, more gently, and she knelt in the mud despite the weight of her own belly, and she opened her cloak so that the light of the pendant fell across the small slack face of the child the older girl was carrying. "I am the healer of Brier Hollow. Give him to me, and run to the bell tower well, and tell every soul you find on the way that the water there is about to come up cold and clean, and they may drink from it as much as they need." Do you understand? The girl nodded, very slowly. She passed the child down into Wren's arms. Wren had healed perhaps 200 people in her 4 months at Brier Hollow. She had set bones, and drawn fevers, and stitched cuts, and brewed teas. She had thought, until tonight, that she was a healer, because she had a steady hand and a good memory for herbs. She understood now that she had been a healer because she had been her mother's daughter, and because her mother had been her grandmother's daughter, and because something in the line of women whose names had been struck from the records had been waiting in her hands for 35 years to be asked to come out. She pressed her palm to the child's small chest. The pendant flared. The light that came out of her hand this time was not white. It was the soft gold of a hearth, and it sank into the child's chest the way warm honey sinks into bread, and Wren felt, very clearly, the moment the smoke that had been clogging the small lungs lifted free of them, and the moment the small heart, which had been stuttering, took up a steady rhythm again. The child opened his eyes. He looked at Wren without fear. "Mama," he said. It was not the right word for her, but it was the word he had, and he reached up with one small soot-blackened hand and touched her face. And Wren made a sound that was not a sound she had made before, and she pressed her cheek against his soot-blackened hair and held him. Above her, very softly, Halric Vorn said, "Sable, I am here. There are more. I know." She rose, with the child still in her arms, and she carried him to the older girl, who was waiting and weeping, and she set him into the older girl's hands, and she said, "Run." The girl ran. Wren turned to Halric. "Take me to the wells," she said. What happened over the next half hour, the survivors of Coldreach would tell their grandchildren about for the rest of their lives, and the survivors' grandchildren would tell theirs. And by the time the story had passed through enough mouths to become a song, it would no longer be a story about a queen who put her hand into 3 wells and called the water up to put out a fire. It would be a story about a small woman in a torn midnight blue cloak with a stone glowing at her throat, who walked through a burning market town with a king at her side, and who knelt at the lip of the bell tower well, and who said 4 words in a language no one in the valley had ever heard, and who watched as the water came up over the stone rim of the well, and ran down the sides and gathered itself, in the air, into a long ribbon of clean, cold light that moved against the wind, against the slope, against the laws by which water in this kingdom was meant to move, and that found the burning granary, and put it out. It was a story they would never quite agree on the details of, but they would agree, every one of them, that the King of the North, who had been said by some to be a hard man and by others to be a cold one, had walked beside her through the smoke with one hand held just behind her elbow, as if he were afraid she would fall, and that he had not taken his eyes off her once. By the time the last of the fire was out, Wren was on her knees in the mud beside the bell tower well. She could not feel her hands. She had healed 17 people in the course of the half hour. She had pulled smoke from 4 sets of lungs, set 2 broken arms, closed a head wound that should have killed an old man, and brought back a baby who had stopped breathing 20 minutes before they reached his mother. Each one, alone, would have left her dizzy. Together, they had emptied her in a way she had not known she could be emptied. The pendant against her chest had gone cold and dim. Halric Vornin knelt beside her in the mud. "Sable, I am all right. You are not. I am all right. Halric, do not make me argue." He did not argue. He gathered her up against his chest, very carefully, with the same caution he had used in the saddle, and he held her there with the side of her face pressed against the wool of his coat, and his hand spread protectively over the curve of her belly, and Wren let herself, for the first time since the gala, fully lean. The children kicked once, gently, beneath his palm. He bent his head over hers and breathed once, slow and uneven, and Wren felt the front of his coat grow damp against her cheek, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. It was Rowan Caradoc who broke the moment. "My king." "Yes, Rowan." "There is a rider coming up the southern road." Halric went very still. "How many?" "One, my king. Alone. Under a white banner." "A herald?" "Yes, my king." "From whom?" Rowan paused. "He bears the silver doe of House Aethwen." Halric's arm did not loosen around Ren, but she felt his entire body change. It was the change a wolf made an instant before it shifted, and it was the change a king made an instant before he passed sentence, and it was the change a man made when the woman he loved had just set herself on her knees in the mud to save children he would never know the names of, and the people who had ordered that town to be burned had now sent a rider to talk to him. "Bring him to the green," Halric said. "I will receive him there, with the queen." "My king, the queen is—" "With the queen, Rowan, my king." Ren tried to say something. Her voice would not quite come. Halric bent and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and he carried her across the muddy market square to the steps of the bell tower, where the survivors had begun to gather in a wide, silent ring, and he sat with her on the lowest step with her in his lap and her head on his shoulder. "You will not let me go in there alone," she whispered against his throat. "No. You will not let me speak to her if she comes herself." "No." "Halric." "Yes. If the rider has come to make terms, the terms are a trap." "I know. They want me alive." "I know that too." "Why?" His arm tightened around her. "Because of the pendant," he said, very quietly. "Because of what just happened at the well. Because the seer in the village beneath my fortress told me, on the morning I left, that the line of women whose names were struck from the records was struck from them not because they were dangerous, but because they were the only ones in this kingdom who could undo a thing that the Council of the Southern Provinces did to the land 400 years ago, a thing that the Council has been profiting from ever since, and that has been killing the soil one province at a time, and that no one has been able to even name in 400 years because the only women who could name it were all dead." Ren closed her eyes. "My grandmother was the last. She died. She was killed, Sable. My mother was killed. I am the last." "You are not," Halric said. He spread his fingers, very gently, across the curve of her belly. "There are 3 of you." The herald came up the southern road at a slow, ceremonial walk. He carried his white banner upright, and he reined in at the edge of the green, and he dismounted, and he bowed once, very low in the direction of the bell tower. "Lord of the North," he called, "I am the herald of House Aethwen, and I bring an offer from my lady." Halric Vorn did not stand. "Speak it." "My lady offers the queen safe passage to the high hall of the southern provinces, where the council will hear her case and rule upon the matter of the false bond. My lady asks only that the queen come to the high hall alone, without escort, by the hour of noon tomorrow, and that she bring with her the stone she carries at her throat. In exchange, my lady will withdraw all warrants against the queen's life, all warrants against the queen's children, and all warrants against the Lord of the North and his house. And if the queen does not come?" The herald paused. "My lady regrets that the warrants will be carried out." "And the children of Coldreach?" "My lady regrets the events of this morning. The fires were set without her knowledge, by an overzealous member of her household. The household member has been dismissed." Halric did not laugh, but Ren felt the long, slow breath he took in, and she felt the small, amused thing that moved through him on the way out, and she understood that he had heard exactly the same thing in those words that she had. "You may tell your lady," he said, "that the Queen of the North has heard her offer." "She accepts it? She has heard it? Go." The herald bowed again. He remounted. He turned his horse and he rode back down the southern road with his white banner upright, and he did not look back. Halric turned his head against Ren's hair. "Sable," Yes, you are not going to the High Hall alone. I know. You are not going to the High Hall at all. Halric. No. Halric. Listen to me. I am listening, but I am not agreeing. They will burn another town tomorrow if I do not come, and another the day after. Not because they want the towns to burn, but because they want me to know that they can keep doing it until I run out of valleys to save. Then we ride for the Iron Mountains tonight. We outpace them. We... Halric. She turned in his arms, in his lap, on the lowest step of a bell tower in a town she had not known existed yesterday, and she pressed her hand against his face, and she made him look at her. They are not chasing me to kill me, she said. If they wanted me dead, the bolt at Brier Hollow would have been a clean shaft, not a poisoned one. The poison was a sedative. I have brewed it twice myself for the village midwife. They want me alive, and they want the children alive, and they want the stone, because they have understood, the way you have understood, that a daughter of my line is the only thing in this kingdom that can undo the thing they have been doing to the land for 400 years. They will not stop. They will never stop. Not until I walk into the high hall and I face them in front of the council, and the council itself sees what it has been protecting. Sable. I have to go, Halric. Not alone. No, she said, very quietly. Not alone. She took his hand and turned it palm up between them, and she pressed her own palm flat against his, the way two people press their hands together to measure the difference, and she felt the bond in her wrist answer. Not the burn it had been for 4 months. Something steadier. Something that had stopped fighting itself. I am going to walk into the high hall, she said, with the king of the north on one side of me, and the first hand of the north on the other side of me, and the 4 wolves of the king's guard at our backs, and the pendant of 9 generations of struck-out women at my throat. I am going to tell them, in front of the council, what they did to the land. I am going to tell them what they did to my grandmother, and what they did to my mother, and what they tried to do to me. I am going to name Marisol Aethwin by her true name, and I am going to name the third hand whose name we do not yet know. And then I am going to do, in front of the council, what my mother taught me to do when I was 6 years old and did not yet understand. And after that, Halric Vorn, I am going to come home with you. He was crying. He did not know it. Home where? He said. His voice broke on it. Wherever you are. He kissed her. It was not like Calem's kissing in the orchard. It was not the kiss of a young man who had been told all his life that he could have what he wanted. It was the kiss of a man who had ridden 11 days through a winter storm to find a woman he did not know, and who had stood at a western window and watched her run, and who had searched 7 provinces for 4 months without sleep, and who had told himself every one of those nights that he would let her go if she asked him to, and who had not been asked. It was the kiss of a man who had, against every intention he had ridden south with, been answered. Wren kissed him back. The bond in her wrist, the bond she had spent 4 months mistaking for the worst thing that had happened to her, lit up beneath her sleeve like a struck match, and held. The survivors of Coldreach, gathered in their wide silent ring around the bell tower, did not look away. They had earned the right to see it. They rode for the high hall at first light. Halric Vorn did not sleep that night. Rowan Caradoc did not sleep. The 4 wolves of the guard slept in shifts of 1, and the people of Coldreach who had houses still standing put Wren herself into a clean bed in the upper room of the bell tower's keeper, with the keeper's wife sitting up beside her with a candle, and Wren slept without dreams for the first time in 4 months, and woke in the cold dark before dawn, with her hand on her belly and a steadiness inside her she had not felt since she had been 7 years old. She rose. She dressed in the clothes the women of Coldreach had brought her in the night. They had taken her torn cloak and her travel-stained dress, and they had washed and mended what could be mended, and they had brought from the chest of the woman who had been the wife of the burgomaster a gown the color of deep river water, with long sleeves that hid the bond mark on her wrist, and a high collar from which the pale river stone could hang openly. They had braided her hair the way the women of the southern provinces had braided their daughters' hair on the day of their first naming. They had pinned the braid with a single white flower from the burgomaster's wife's own garden. When Wren came down the steps of the bell tower into the gray dawn, the entire town of Coldreach had gathered in the square. They did not cheer. They did not bow. They stood in silence and watched her walk the length of the square to the place where Halric Vorne waited beside the great black stallion. And when she reached him, the burgomaster, who had nearly died of his head wound the morning before, stepped forward and took her hand and pressed his forehead against the back of it. "Queen of the North," he said, "we will tell our children's children that you were here." Wren bent and put her hand against his face. "Tell them," she said, "that the women of the line of the Riverstone are not finished yet." The ride to the High Hall took until noon. The High Hall of the Southern Provinces had been built 400 years ago, on the site of the council that had ordered the names of the Riverstone women struck from every record. Halric told her the history quietly, as they rode. He told her things the seer in the village beneath his fortress had told him on the morning he left. He told her about the binding the council had laid into the soil of the southern provinces 400 years ago, a working that drew the strength of the earth slowly upward into the great houses of the south and left the soil thinner and thinner with each passing generation, and how the binding had been laid by 12 men of 12 houses, and how the council had, ever since, been 12 seats, and how the seats had passed from father to son for 400 years without question, and how the line of the women who alone could break that binding had been hunted and killed, generation after generation, every time they came too close to remembering what they were. "And Marisol Aethwen?" Wren asked. "Is the daughter of the 11th seat? The Aethwens hold one of the 12. They have held it for the full 400 years. And the third hand?" Halric was silent for a moment. "The Vendron house holds the 12th seat," he said. "But the third hand is not a Vendron. The third hand is the man who has been telling House Aethwen and House Vendron what to do for the last 20 years. He sits on no seat. He holds no land. He is the steward of the High Hall itself, and his name is Vorun Caltha." "Caltha? Yes. My grandmother's name," Wren said slowly, "was Aelin Caltha." Halric Vorn looked at her. "I know. She was killed by her own family. By her own brother, the grandfather of Vorun Caltha. He has been hunting his own line. For 400 years, the men of the Caltha house have been killing the women of the Caltha house. It is the oldest of the 12 houses. It was the first to bind. It will be the last to fall." Wren rode in silence for a moment. "And Calum," she said, "is in a holding cell in the eastern wing of the High Hall," Halric said quietly. "My riders took him from the Varith estate 3 nights ago, when we understood the Aethwens would try to use him against you again. He is unharmed. He has been told nothing of where you are. He will be released after the council, into whatever life he chooses to make from what is left of his." Wren nodded, slowly. She did not ask whether she would see him. She did not yet know whether she wanted to. Wren rode the last mile of that road in silence. The High Hall rose at the head of a long stone causeway across a flat gray lake. It was a building of dark stone and high narrow windows, and there were 12 banners flying above it, and the 12th, on the western tower, was the silver doe of House Aethwen. The council had assembled in the great chamber. 12 men sat in 12 high-carved chairs. A 13th chair, slightly lower, slightly to one side, was occupied by a thin, gray-haired man in a dark robe whose face Wren did not need to be told to recognize. Vorun Caltha had her grandmother's eyes. He did not look at her when she entered. He looked at his folded hands. Marisol Aethwen sat at the foot of her father's chair on a low cushion. She wore a gown the color of a winter sky. Her hair had been let down for the occasion, and she was beautiful in the way she had always been beautiful, and she did not look at Ren either. Calum Varith was not in the room. Halric Vorn walked Ren the length of the chamber on his arm. He did not bow at the foot of the dais. "Council of the Southern Provinces," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I bring before you Sable Renwick of the line of Calthy, daughter of Iselma Calthy, granddaughter of Aelin Calthy, great-granddaughter of Mireth Calthy, and so on back, through 9 generations of women whose names you have struck from your records and whose blood you have spilled. And I bring her here today to speak to you in their voices, and to do, in this hall, the thing they were killed to prevent." The chamber went very still. Voron Kalta lifted his head at last. "My niece," he said. Ren did not answer. She walked, on Halric Vorna's arm, to the open space at the foot of the dais. She turned her back on the council. She faced instead the long pale stone of the floor and the seam in the stone that ran the length of the chamber from the dais to the great doors, and the small dark mark in the center of the floor where the binding had been laid 400 years ago. She knelt. It cost her, in her 6th month, to kneel. Halric knelt with her, one hand under her elbow, the other against her back. Rowan Caradoc knelt at her left shoulder. The 4 wolves of the guard who had come up the causeway with them and had been allowed into the chamber as her escort under the laws of Parlier knelt in a half-circle behind them. Ren put both hands flat against the cold stone of the floor. She closed her eyes. She said the 4 words her mother had taught her, in the language her mother had not lived long enough to teach her the meaning of. The pendant at her throat went white. The white light ran down her arms, into her hands, into the stone. It did not flare outward. It sank inward. It went down, through the stone of the floor, through the stone of the foundations, through the stone the high hall had been built upon, into the binding the 12 men had laid 400 years ago. The binding answered. It did not answer Ren. It did not have a voice for that. It answered the line that ran in her blood, and it answered the children that turned beneath her ribs, and it answered the pendant her mother had given her on her 7th birthday, and what it gave back, when it answered, was 400 years of locked-away strength in the soil of the southern provinces, rising at last, the way a tide rises when the moon at last comes back into the right house. Voron Kalthi screamed. It was not a scream of pain. It was the scream of a man who had lived for 70 years on stolen ground, and who had felt, in the space of a heartbeat, the ground decide that it would no longer carry him. He clutched at his chest. He fell forward out of his low chair. The other 11 men of the council clutched at their own chests, every one of them, and one by one they fell forward in their high-carved chairs, and their faces went gray, and their hands went to their throats. They did not die. The binding had not been a thing that could be killed by killing them, and Ren had not come to kill them. They sagged in their chairs like men who had aged 40 years in a single breath, their hair gone whiter, their hands gone thinner, their breath gone shallow but steady, and they were old men now. Ordinary old men, no longer holding what they had held, and the chairs they sat in had become only chairs. Marisol Aithwen had not fallen. She had risen. She had crossed the chamber in 3 quick strides, and she had drawn from beneath her gown a long, thin knife, the color of bone, and she had put the knife against the side of Ren's throat before Halric Vorn could move. The chamber froze. "Stand up," Marisol said. Her voice was not steady. "Stand up, Sable, or I will open your throat in front of every wolf in this room." Ren opened her eyes. She did not stand. "Marisol," she said very quietly, "look at me. Stand up. Marisol, look at me. I will do it. I swear by the silver doe I will do it. You ungrateful little kitchen rat. You do not know what you have just done. I know what I have just done. You have killed my father. I have not killed your father. I have only made him an old man. He will live another 10 years on the stipend of the new council, the same stipend as everyone else. You have ruined 12 houses. I have freed a province. You have... Marisol. The knife was shaking against Ren's throat. The cold of it was very precise. Halric Vorn had not moved. Rowan Caradoc had not moved. The 4 wolves had not moved. Every wolf in the chamber understood, at the level of breath, that any movement would be the movement that killed her. Ren reached up very slowly, and she put her hand over Marisol Aethwin's hand on the hilt of the knife. She did not push. She did not pull. She only held. Marisol, she said, do you remember the winter we shared the bed in the attic? The knife trembled. Do you remember? Ren said. The night the wind came in through the cracked pane, and we laid your blue shawl over the both of us, and you cried because your hands were too cold to feel, and I held them between mine until you slept? Stop. Do you remember telling me that winter that you had never had a sister? Stop. I remember it. Sable. You are not going to open my throat, Marisol. I will. You will not. Because I have not come to take your house from you. The Aethwins will hold their lands. You will hold them, after your father, because there is no one else in your line, and the new council I am going to convene tomorrow will have 12 seats, and one of them will be yours, and you will sit in it as the first woman of the southern provinces to hold a seat in 400 years, and you will sit beside the 11 men or women you have spent your life trying to outmaneuver, and you will earn your place at that table the way they will earn theirs. And the bond you took from me at Hollowmere Manor by poisoning a boy who had loved me is gone now, and Calum Vairith woke this morning in a holding cell in the eastern wing of this hall, where Halric Vorn's men placed him last night under guard for his own safety, and he is no longer yours either. But he is not coming back to me, Marisol, because he is not who I want. And what I want is sitting beside me. And what I want is what is inside me. And what I want is the council I am going to build out of the ruin of yours. And you can be in it, or you can be in a cell. Choose. The knife slipped. It did not fall. Marisol's hand had not let go of it, but the edge had come away from Ren's throat by half an inch, and her hand had begun to shake too hard to hold the angle. Marisol Aethwin sank to her knees on the cold stone. She did not let go of the knife. She held it against her own thigh with both hands, the way a child holds a thing she has been told to give up, and she put her forehead against the floor, and she made a sound that was not a sound Ren had ever heard her make in 15 years of knowing her. Ren reached out, and after a long moment she took the knife. She put it on the stone beside her. She put her hand on the back of Marisol Aethwin's bent head. You are not forgiven, she said. Not today. Perhaps not for many years. But you are not dead, and your house is not dead, and the children inside me have one of your braids tied into the pattern of their mother's hair, and that is something. Marisol wept against the cold stone. Halric Vorn, beside Ren, was looking at her in a way no one had ever looked at her in her life. Sable, he said. Yes. I would like to take you home now. All right. I would like, if you will allow it, to claim the bond that has been growing between us properly, before the wolves of this hall, so that there can be no question afterward. All right. Now? Now. He turned to her on his knees beside her on the cold floor of the high hall, and Ren turned to him, and the wolves of the guard rose and stepped back, to give them the small ring of space the old custom required, and the 11 old men who had been the council watched in silence from their high carved chairs, and Marisol Aethwin wept against the stone, and Ren put her hand against Halric Vorn's jaw, and tilted her own head, and bared the place where her shoulder met her neck. Halric Vorna bent his head. He set his teeth, very carefully, against her skin. Sable Renwick of the line of Calthy, he said, against her throat. I take you as my mate, by my blood, by my wolf, by the honor of my house, and by the witness of every wolf within these walls. From this hour forward, what is mine is yours. What is mine to spend, I will spend on you. What is mine to defend, I will defend with you. And what is mine to lay down, I will lay down beside you. There is no other I will name. There is no other. There is no other. He bit. The bond sealed. The white light at her throat, and the gold light in her hands, and the pale green light in his eyes met in the small space between them and folded into one. And Wren saw, in that one fold of light, every dream she had had of him in 4 months, and every night he had reached for her through the dark, and every grief he had carried alone in a fortress at the end of a long road, and she let him see, in return, every day of Brier Hollow, and every winter of the attic, and every moment of the eastern gallery, and every mile of the road north. And the bond did what bonds were meant to do, and the two of them came out of it, knowing each other entirely. When he lifted his head, there were tears on his face. There were tears on hers as well. She set her own teeth, very carefully, against the place where his shoulder met his neck, and she gave him the answer the bond required, in her own voice, in her own words. Halric Vorn of the 7 provinces, she said, I take you as my mate, by my blood, by my line, by the river stone and the broken binding and the witness of every wolf within these walls. From this hour forward, what is mine is yours. What is mine to spend, I will spend on you. What is mine to defend, I will defend with you. And what is mine to lay down, I will lay down beside you. There is no other I will name. There is no other. There is no other. She bit. The bond sealed on her side. The high hall, 400 years old, built on a binding that had just been broken, settled around them with the quiet sound of a thing that had been holding a long breath and was now letting it go. The years that followed were neither easy nor quick. Halric Vorne and Sable Renwick rode home to the 7 provinces in the first warm days of summer, and the seer in the village beneath his fortress met them on the road and bowed her old gray head to the woman she had felt waking in her king's chest one night 4 months before. The fortress had been made ready. The room that had been the queen's room since the days of Halric's grandmother had been opened and aired for the first time in 50 years. Rowan Caradoc was the first to cross the threshold of that room, with the small carved chest the women of Coldreach had pressed into his hands at the gates of their burned town, and he set it down on the great oak chest at the foot of the bed, and he turned to her and said, in his old soldier's voice that did not crack, though it nearly did, "Welcome home, my queen." She held him while he wept. She did not tell him she had seen him weep before, in the cellar at Brier Hollow, when he had thought she was not looking. The children were born as the leaves began to turn. A girl first. Black hair, her mother's mouth, eyes the same pale green as the wolf in the whispering pines, with hands that were warm when she touched them to her father's tear-streaked face. A boy second, 10 minutes later, smaller, fair-haired, with eyes that could not yet decide a color but that would, by his first year, settle into the deep river water gray of Sable's own. Halric Vorn held them both against his chest, one in the crook of each arm, and he wept openly in front of half the household, and no one in the 7 northern provinces ever again called him a cold man. Calum Vairith was given his life back. He was not given his place in House Vairith. The poisoning had unmade his standing in the eyes of his own house, and the news of what had happened at Hollowmere had unmade it further, and he chose, in the end, to take a small holding in the western coast provinces, where the moss draught had been first brewed, and to spend the rest of his life finding the caves it grew in and burning them out one by one. Sable wrote him once, in the autumn after the children were born. The letter was short. I do not blame you. I never did. Be well, Calum. He did not write back, but the year after, a basket of pears from the orchard behind his small holding arrived at the gates of the fortress in the north, with no note. And the year after that, another. And the year after that, a third. The pears were always sent in the third week of the autumn moon, and the household of the fortress understood in time what they were for, and the Queen of the North never told them. Marisol Aethwin took her father's seat on the new council the year after he died. She held it for 31 years. She married late, a quiet scholar from the Middle Provinces who never raised his voice. She had no children of her own. She visited the fortress in the north 4 times in those 31 years, and on the 4th visit, when she was an old woman and Sable was an old woman, the two of them sat together by a window for an entire afternoon in silence. And when Marisol rose at last to leave, she put her hand against Sable's cheek and said, "Thank you for not opening my throat, sister." Sable said, "Thank you for not opening mine." They did not embrace. They did not need to. Marisol died the following winter, and the Queen of the North wept for her for 3 nights, and would not be comforted, and Halric Vorna held her each of those 3 nights without saying a word. Voren Calthy lived his 10 years on the stipend, as Sable had said he would, and he died in a small room in the southern foothills that had once been a kitchen, and he was buried in unmarked earth, and no one came to mourn him. The land of the southern provinces healed. The first year, the wheat came up green for the first time in a generation. The second year, the rivers ran higher than they had in 50. By the 7th year, the southern provinces were feeding 3 of their neighbors, and the new council, which now had 4 women on it, and would in time have 6, met every spring at the High Hall, and it was the Queen of the North, traveling south for the meeting, who opened the proceedings each year with the 4 words her mother had taught her when she was 6. The river stone never glowed for her again, the way it had at Coldreach. She did not need it to. She used it to settle the children to sleep, and to warm her hands in winter. And once, when her daughter, at the age of 9, cut her hand to the bone on a kitchen knife, the stone flared once for the girl, and the cut closed before Halric came in from the courtyard, and the Queen of the North pressed her forehead against her small daughter's small forehead and said, "There you are, my love. There is the line. You have it now. Be careful with it. Be kind." Halric Vorn lived to be 73. Sable Renwick lived to be 76. They were buried in the same stone vault, in the village beneath the fortress, in a place the seer had set aside for them on the night the king had ridden south. The stone over the vault carried no titles. It carried only 2 names, and the date of their bonding, and beneath that, in a small, neat hand, the 4 words Sable's mother had taught her, in the language no one in the 7 provinces had ever needed to translate. The grandchildren visited the vault every spring. By the time the great-grandchildren came, the vault had become a small place of pilgrimage for the women of the southern provinces who had begun, quietly and without fanfare, to discover that their hands too could be warm when they were needed to be. They came with offerings of pears in the 3rd week of the autumn moon, and white flowers from gardens they had grown themselves, and small carved stones, and they sat by the vault, and they said their grandmothers' names aloud, and the names were not struck from the records anymore. The names were written in the books of the new council, and the books were kept in the High Hall, and the High Hall, 400 years old and built on a broken binding, stood the whole long while. 2 old wolves lay in a stone vault beneath a quiet hill. A line of women who had once been forgotten kept walking forward into the years, one daughter at a time, with their hands warm and their stones close, and their names their own. And in the 7 provinces of the north, on the long winter nights when the wind came down off the iron mountains and the children of the children of the children gathered around the great hearths to listen, the old story was told the same way every time. It began in a ballroom with a girl in a midnight blue gown. It ended in a clearing, and on a road, and in a burning valley, and at the foot of a dais in a hall that no longer held its old binding. It ended with two people who had been told all their lives that they were not allowed to be happy, walking out of a cold stone hall together into the spring. And the children, listening every time, asked the same question at the end. And then what happened? And the old wolf telling the story, every time, smiled the small, slow smile of a wolf who had heard the question many times before and gave the same answer. Then they went home, and they were not parted again.